Next panel discussion is coastal STEM diversity, persistence, and success. For our discipline to continue and thrive, we need to look at human resources in our community of practice and to ignite enthusiasm in new generations. In part, this means making our professions more accessible and representative. This panel is a discussion which focuses on diversity and inclusion in coastal STEM fields. Our panel discussion will be held by Dr. Jane Smith from USACE ERDC. And with that, Jane, you're on.
Thanks, Lee. Welcome to our panel discussion on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Systemic racism has been brought to the forefront this past year following appalling disclosures about police brutality against African Americans. The Black Lives Matter protests have raised the visibility of the inequalities. Also, the COVID pandemic has highlighted inequalities by race, and minority communities have been particularly hard hit. The pandemic is also erasing financial and career gains made by women. To me, some of these problems seem overwhelming. In the past 50 years, the US has made some large steps forward in equality, but there is still so much to do. Why is diversity important to coastal science and engineering? Well, science has shown that diverse teams are more creative and innovative. By bringing together people with different life experiences, we enrich the conversation with new information, perspectives, and questions. Diverse teams have higher publication rates with greater impact. They're more highly cited. And as the importance of science and engineering grows in our society, most minority populations are expanding. We can't afford to overlook this growing pool of talent. We don't have statistics for women and minority participation specifically in coastal science and engineering, but in the STEM workforce, women are underrepresented by a factor of 2, African Americans and Hispanics by more than a factor of 2. Women in STEM fields earn about 20% less than men. Blacks and Hispanics make 15 to 20% less than whites. And if you conflate race and gender, these disparities are even greater. One bright spot is this ASBPA conference. It's about evenly split by gender. But my experience is that coastal science and engineering, our community is not very racially diverse. The goal of this panel is to discuss how we make our profession stronger through equality, diversity, and inclusion. What can we do as a profession? How about ASBPA and as individuals? Before we start, I want to say a special thanks to Jessica Norris and Derek Brockbank for helping to make this panel possible. We have 4 excellent panelists with a wealth of experience. They're very talented women. We actually wanted to have a more diverse panel. We wanted to have men on it too. It's unusual in our field to have a lack of male representation. It wasn't intentional. Each panelist came highly recommended and has a story to tell. After each provides prepared remarks, we'll have time for questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your questions anytime during the panel. And if you want to address a specific panelist, just include their name. As time allows, the panelists will answer questions at the end. Let's get started. Our first panelist is Dr. Olivia Scriven. She's president and CEO of Partners for Education Development, Inc., a consulting firm specializing in working with organizations to increase their research, education, and community engagement capacity. She has 20 years of experience in STEM program design and evaluation. Her PhD is in the history of science and technology from Georgia Tech, and her scholarship examines race, gender, institutional climates, and public policy in STEM. Dr. Scriven, why is equality, diversity, and inclusion so important to attract vibrancy, talent, and skills for the future of our profession?
Is that a question or should I begin my presentation?
That's a question that leads you off on your presentation.
Well, again, and this has been a question that has pervaded public policy since the end of World War II. But as we talk about the engagement of underrepresented groups and disciplines critical to sustaining healthy and resilient coastal systems, we must involve all populations in order to increase that talent and, as you pointed out, contribute to innovation. And on that note, I'm actually going to share my screen and start my presentation so that we can dig into that a little bit more. So, you know, as in my remarks today, I want to provide a brief historical context and then talk a little bit more about intervention models that have emerged through the years in order to increase engagement, recruitment, and performance of underrepresented groups in these target STEM disciplines. And so as you see here, and I'm hopeful that you can see my full screen, and perhaps there's a way to minimize the pictures on the side. But again, as you see here, the issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM has been a matter of public policy since the close of World War II. In the aftermath of the Soviet launch of Sputnik, legislation was passed, the National Defense Education Act, and here you see in that authorization language this notion of talent. The conversation was the US wasn't doing enough, the Soviets had beat us to the punch, and what could be done to increase our STEM education. Later in the 1960s, you know, in the midst of civil rights and women's rights mobilization, the conversation focused on who gets to participate in science, the nature of that participation, and equitable distribution of resources. Title III of the Higher Education Act of 1965 specifically looked at historically Black colleges and universities, which then, as for a large part as they do today, educate and graduate a disproportionate number of African Americans in STEM disciplines as compared to their representation in higher education. Women's rights and the passage of Title IX of the Education Amendment Act didn't necessarily only focus on STEM, but also focus on this issue of who gets to participate in the equitable distribution of resources. In the 1980s, the conversation focused on global economic competitiveness. And you see this emergence of this language about talent and a pipeline. And here, borrowing from supply side economics, the concern was that the US needed to do more in order to begin to better assess what was being produced, the supply as compared to the need. But even within this, there were still conversations about the fact that women and racial ethnic minorities were being underutilized, and this notion of a pipeline as a metaphor and a research methodology to examine flow data was insufficient for public policy. We really needed to understand what contributed to the flow, what impacted the flow. In other words, we needed to understand behavior. And so you had the passage of the Education Economic Security Act to really talk about pre-college programs and undergraduate programs as part of that pipeline. Fast forward to the 21st century, we are still having this conversation. The President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technologies, again, talked about projected shortages in STEM, the STEM workforce. And they argued that we needed 1 million more than was originally projected. And so that's where we stand today. But even within these conversations, there have been models that have come out that really talks about how do you increase performance. And I want to talk about 3 of those today. The interventions that I will discuss focus on mentoring, research training, and bridge programs. And these interventions can be applied in various organizational contexts across various sectors. So I hope it will help stimulate some conversation. When we look at this idea of mentoring, and that's been bandied about for quite some time, but at its core, mentoring is about relationships with intention. Pairing a more senior person with somebody perhaps more junior to talk about a plan for growth, strategies and steps in order to effect that growth, and to assess progress along the way. And mentoring has been an intervention that has been used by HBCUs for quite some time, and it has gained traction across higher education over the past 20 years. One program that has been very successful in this effort is the EDGE program. This is a program that was born out of collaboration between two female mathematicians, one at Spelman College, a historically Black college for women in Atlanta, Georgia, and Bryn Mawr College, one of the so-called 7 sister institutions located in the Northeast in Pennsylvania. They wanted to figure out a way to increase the number of women and women who are racial ethnic minorities completing the PhD in the mathematical sciences. So they developed this program in order to effect and provide a more structured approach to one-on-one mentoring. As the program went national, and they sought to also increase women leadership visibility in the mathematical sciences, particularly in academia. They went to a multi-pronged approach, and one innovative aspect there was this idea of creating these mentoring clusters where groups would be clustered in geographic proximity to one another, and this would provide a platform in a safe space to talk about those issues impacting their graduate career and their early career in the profession. How were they doing? What were the barriers being faced? And what were some strategies? What strategies could be implemented to overcome those barriers? And again, I want to emphasize that the program, it not only focused on undergrad, but grad school. And once they got into the academic profession, junior and senior faculty. And the program, since its establishment, has produced 107 what they call edgers, or 107 women who have completed the PhD in the mathematical sciences since the program's inception. Another intervention strategy that I'd like to discuss, and this is something that is not only applicable to reaching and engaging underrepresented groups, but in STEM more broadly, in order to increase recruitment and engagement and persist to the degree. And that is the idea of early and sustained exposure to research. And when we talk about that within the context of diversity, inclusion, engaging students in research helps to forge identities as a scientist, as an engineer. It helps to feel part of a community. So you're not the other on the outside, but you are now part of this community that is actually engaged in the process of doing science and learning how to construct those questions and expand those research questions that only focus on things that are personally meaningful, but also help to positively impact communities. And this is an intervention strategy that has also proven to be quite effective to reach and engage and help underrepresented groups to persist to the degree. The last intervention mechanism that I want to talk about are bridge programs. And these are programs that are designed to facilitate transition from one stage to the next. Whether or not you're working with high school students and helping them transition into 2 or 4-year programs, or you're working with undergraduates and helping them to transition to graduate programs, or you're working with grad students transitioning to a postdoc appointment or a postdoc to your first professional appointment. It helps to bridge the gap between expectation and reality. It helps you to understand what to expect and how to navigate organizational culture so that you can increase your chances of performance and success. And one program that has done this quite well, it's not specifically exclusive to Bridge, but has done this quite well, is the LSAT program, the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation, that comes out of the National Science Foundation. It is a comprehensive program and includes Bridge elements, but it's also based on Tinto's model of student retention. And in that model, the onus is taken off of the individual as though something is wrong with the individual, and places the onus on the organization to create systems, to create structures in order to help those students progress from one level to the next. And I'm going to stop there because I think I've reached my 8-minute cap. But hopefully if there are any questions, I'll certainly feel free to answer those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Our second panelist is Dr. Talea Mayo. She's an assistant professor at Emory University, and she is a computational mathematician with expertise in numerical models for coastal hazards, specializing in coastal storm surge model development and application. Her PhD is from the University of Texas in computational science, engineering, and mathematics. She's going to tell us about recruiting intention in STEM based on her academic experience.
So I personally can speak to the various levels of support and mentorship that are provided to women and people from underrepresented groups throughout the academic career path. For me, at the undergraduate level, I felt there were a number of programs and opportunities that were specifically designed to improve the representation in STEM fields. And I was able to participate in 3 separate internships, which all had this as a primary goal. And I think that was effective in giving me the tools and the interest to enter graduate studies for me in mathematics. Once I entered graduate school, I feel like those opportunities started to decrease. So there are some formal programs that exist with the same goal of increasing participation, but none of these were explicitly available at my school. And so I kind of had to find my own systems of support through the Black Graduate Student Association and other smaller organizations, not specifically designed for this. So I was able to find support in a way that was sufficient for me to continue trying to succeed in graduate school. I did obtain a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, and that program, though not explicitly designed to improve representation, does have that as a goal. And it was very pivotal for me in encouraging me to continue my efforts in graduate school. I feel in general, postdoc experiences are completely dependent on the postdoc advisor. And for me, I had a very good postdoc advisor. She was a role model for me as far as being a woman in STEM, but there were no formal systems of support for underrepresented minorities or women. And so again, I was kind of able to seek out a network through various organizations that maybe weren't explicitly designed for postdocs, weren't explicitly designed for STEM, and in my case, engineering, but were helpful to me. As I sought a faculty position, I feel I was recruited. My position was financially supported using what was called a diversity line. So I think at the time, one of the strategic goals of my university included broadening participation of students and faculty. However, once I actually got there, I found that there was really no support surrounding diversity or inclusions of women or Black faculty. And for me, I was getting kind of poor evaluations that really didn't consider the diversity of my academic training. So I had changed academic disciplines. I was not provided a lot of institutional resources, and that was not considered in the way that I was evaluated. I had gone on maternity leave. That was also not considered. And I had also done substantial work towards diversity and inclusion, which included a $3.8 million grant. And, you know, it just wasn't really recognized. And so the level of or the lack of support at that level actually was problematic for me, and had an adverse effect. I could not make up for it with my own self-found mentoring networks, even though I did have some great mentors that I found on my own, but just the lack of support ultimately led me to withdraw from my position. Like, I knew I could not be successful in that kind of environment. So in the end, I think I've learned that, you know, the issues surrounding diversity and inclusion are really more than one of just recruiting. It's really about retention. And retention is all about creating an inclusive culture. So you cannot retain people if you do not create an environment where they feel supported. So to that end, the question should always be, how do we create this type of environment in which people, and in particular women and Black people and other people from underrepresented groups, want to stay? I would say that there's no one solution, but at an absolute minimum, people have to feel valued, which means they have to be valued from the places that they're at.
Thank you so much, Talea. Excellent. Hope we'll get a lot of questions from that. Our third panelist is Dr. Maritza. She's Director of Coastal Research and Planning in Puerto Rico at University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. Her research focuses on applied and interdisciplinary assessment of shoreline erosion and accretion in island environments. Her recent work is focused on Hurricanes Maria and Irma. Her PhD is from the University of Puerto Rico in geological oceanography. Dr. Barreto, she's going to talk about a roadmap for promoting equality and inclusion in STEM fields.
Good morning. As a woman, Hispanic, Puerto Rican, as a coastal geologist, and as a professor from a higher education institution, I have faced many challenges pursuing the goal of generating research and presenting recommendations to promote better coastal planning and decision-making processes in Puerto Rico. I know very well what it is to bring proposals on the table based on very good science and community feedback, and sometimes not be here. According to the American Geological Institute, women and Hispanic population members are still underrepresented in geosciences. As well, Hispanic women are still underrepresented in fields as coastal geology, coastal geomorphology, and coastal planning. This is a problem because we need more experts in science and technology to enhance coastal planning and resilience, reduce environmental impact, and find more efficient course of action to mitigate coastal risks facing extreme events and climate changes. Based on my professional experience, I can share with you as my opinion, which is the roadmap that professionals associations, universities, and minority groups may follow to promote inclusion for underrepresented groups in the coastal field studies. I'm so sure that inclusion and equality will be possible through promote visibility, practicing science outreach, mentoring, and presenting the importance of how our work serves and impacts society. Some of the course of action as a group that we can take to promote visibility are: become a member of professional and academic associations that make your work known. Share professional experiences with members of this association at the local, regional, and international level. Demand an equal work culture, among others. In terms of associations, academia, and professional groups, they should be: first, focus on capabilities and how those groups contribute to your organization. Promote principles of equity, cooperation, and solidarity. And very important, inclusion should not seek to change or correct the difference of the person, but rather to enrich it. Inclusion should not seek to make the person adapt to the group. It seeks to eliminate the barriers that they encounter that prevent them from participating in the educational and social system. As a part of this, sometimes organizations need to make deep transformation. As example, in our organization, the Coastal Research and Planning Institute of Puerto Rico, we began to execute several of these course of actions, and we have been able to increase the visibility of Puerto Rican women and Hispanic professionals in the coastal study field at the local and international level, especially for new professionals in the field. We still have a lot to do, but we are starting to make a difference. I don't have any doubt that practicing some of these course of actions may serve as a passport toward equality and inclusion.
Thanks so much, Maritza. I'm already hearing some common themes, and please feel free to go ahead and start putting questions in the Q&A. As we get ready for our fourth speaker, Dr. Tahirih Lackey. She's a research hydraulic engineer at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Research and Development Center, Coastal Hydraulics Lab. Her work focuses on modeling Lagrangian transport and complex systems, such as rivers, estuaries, and coastal environments to understand environmental risks due to sediment, contaminants, and man-made structures. Her PhD is in civil and environmental engineering with a focus on computational fluid dynamics from Georgia Tech. Tahirih, tell us about your experiences, particularly working in the federal sector and the importance of being intentional about diversity.
Thanks, Jane. I wanted to start with a favorite quote, if that's okay. Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. I believe that lack of diversity in STEM organizations is just one symptom of systematic racism in our society. Now I'll give a brief history of my experiences in efforts to increase diversity. I received my undergraduate degree at Jackson State University, which is a HBCU, or Historically Black College and University in Mississippi. By their nature, HBCUs tend to have a focus on increasing the diversity in STEM fields. JSU provided very specific and intentional support for research opportunities for their undergraduate students at national research laboratories. While I was an undergrad, I spent time working at institutions like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and the University of Minnesota Supercomputing Institute. JSU and these national laboratories had a relationship which allowed students to work during the summers there, gaining experience in their potential chosen fields. Obviously, it was very important to have this opportunity that provided mentoring and experience in these environments. Those experiences eventually led me to want to work at the Engineer Research and Development Center, where I still am today. When I went to work at ERDC, the Engineer Research and Development Center, I recognized that the environment, like most research organizations, would benefit from increased diversity. In addition, I wanted to give back to the next generation of students by connecting them with programs that bring undergrads from these underrepresented populations to our organization and give them the same type of experience that I'd had, in hopes that they might eventually want to come to work either at ERDC or in similar environments. What I found was that while there was some intentionality, there was an overall lack of emphasis and buy-in. There were small and consistent efforts organized to bring in a diverse group of students from HBCUs and underrepresented groups, and I applaud these efforts. I was able to take part in some of these programs, and I found them extremely fulfilling, and I plan to continue to support them. However, it seemed like there was not an overall buy-in from employees as a whole. There was a small percentage of employees who participated in these programs, mentoring students, but overall there seemed to be a lack of understanding of the importance or motivation for these efforts. There are probably many reasons why this might be the case. I won't even try to list all of them. However, I believe that at this time, there isn't a common vision of diversity as a goal, which means that there's not enough buy-in from the employees for these types of efforts. When I say buy-in, I mean that employees have to understand as a whole that this is important to the organization, and therefore it has to be important to them. Therefore, given an opportunity to support efforts like these, they might not only be participants, but become protagonists or champions for these programs and these efforts. I think that this creates the beginning of a culture of change, which I think is how we increase diversity. I should mention that over the years, I have seen drastic improvements with respect to diversity in my organization, perhaps due to the programs I mentioned previously. And in speaking with members of management prior to this presentation, I understand that conversations are underway to address the topic of diversity. And I'm very excited to support these efforts. I think that ultimately, from my perspective, there needs to be at least two components to increase diversity. One is intentionality, and the second is active participation and buy-in. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks so much. Thank you to all our panelists. We have just a few minutes left and I haven't seen any Q&A questions. So one of the topics that I heard come up over and over was creating this supportive environment. So I invite any of our panelists who would like to talk about how we create this environment or what it means to create a supportive environment. Please chime in. Talea, you want to jump on that one?
Sure. I definitely think part of creating supportive environments includes kind of a culture change, or making sure that you are facilitating a culture where other people can, or diverse groups of people can find themselves belonging. And so maybe like an intentional thing that you can do is, trying to create at a minimum mentorship networks, and not just pairing one person with another person in your organization, but really having like a team, or as Tahirih was talking about, like a buy-in from many people, so that people feel welcome and included.
Anyone else want to make a comment?
Yes, I think that as a part to promote this inclusion is very important, promote the visibility of the group. My experience in Puerto Rico, working with Hispanic women, Puerto Rican women, we noticed that definitely we promote and we develop the space. For example, we are writing grants, proposals to get space that this new professional can practicing, can make research, and also through the mentoring with this group, we found that the visibility can be promoted. And after they have the visibility and they start to still doing research, they start to writing paper, they start to participating in different forums, we found they start to insert very well in the field, and not just in terms of local way, also in different level as an international level.
And this is Olivia, and I guess the one last comment that I would add to creating a culture of buy-in is to first have the conversation about what is diversity, equity, inclusion. What does that look like within your specific organization? And in having that conversation, make it stakeholder inclusive, not just limited groups, but have a very open conversation. What does that look like? What is it? What does it mean to us? What does it not mean? So that you begin to develop a common language and a common awareness, and at least have a conversation about the issue. culture change is a process. And so organizations need to be aware that it is a long-term commitment and it's going to take some time. But the first thought is really having a conversation and a common understanding of what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean for a specific organization. Okay. So
Oh, I think we've reached pretty much the end of this session. I personally firmly believe that in order for our field to thrive in the future, we need to address this important issue. It's critical, especially in the coastal processes and engineering and coastal geology sector. I want to thank Dr. Smith and all the panelists for discussing this important issue with us today.